December 1776, somewhere in the frozen hills of Pennsylvania. A general looked at what remained of his army. Roughly 3,000 exhausted, half-starved men, many without shoes, most with enlistments due to expire in a matter of days. Behind him, chasing him across an entire state, was the most powerful military force on earth, the British Army, under General William Howe, backed by the largest navy in the world, fresh reinforcements, and seemingly unlimited supplies. By every conventional rule of warfare, George Washington's army should have already been destroyed. Instead, he was about to fight the strangest war in military history. A war where refusing to fight became the single most brilliant strategy anyone had ever used to win one. By late 1776, Britain looked unstoppable. The Continental Army had just suffered a string of catastrophic defeats across the New York campaign, Long Island, White Plains, and the disastrous loss of Fort Washington, where nearly 3,000 American soldiers were captured in a single afternoon, along with badly needed cannons and supplies. Washington's army wasn't just losing battles, it was disintegrating, bleeding men to death, disease, desertion, and expiring enlistments faster than it could ever hope to replace them. Britain, meanwhile, held every conventional advantage a military force could ask for. A professional, well-drilled army with decades of experience across a global empire. The Royal Navy controlling the seas, able to move troops and supplies almost anywhere along the American coastline at will. Endless supply lines back to the wealthiest trading power on Earth. All they needed, in the eyes of British command, was one final, decisive battle to crush the rebellion outright and send the remaining rebels home for good. Congress had already fled Philadelphia, fearing the city's imminent capture by advancing British forces. Public support for independence, which had seemed so certain just months earlier when the Declaration was signed, was wavering badly under the weight of repeated defeat. Thomas Paine, marching alongside the retreating army through the New Jersey cold, wrote the line that would come to define the entire moment. These were the times that try men's souls. Washington faced an impossible decision, one that would shape the entire rest of the war. Risk everything on one dramatic battle to save morale and possibly lose the war in a single catastrophic afternoon? Or accept something far less glorious, far less satisfying to an anxious public demanding action? A war fought almost entirely on his own terms, stretched out for as long as it took, no matter how long that turned out to be. Long before he commanded the Continental Army, George Washington had already learned, in the most brutal way possible, exactly what happens when boldness outruns judgment. In 1755, as a young officer serving under British General Edward Braddock during the French and Indian War, Washington rode into a catastrophic ambush along the banks of the Monongahela River. Braddock's force, marching in rigid European formation through dense forest, was torn apart by French and Native American fighters using terrain and cover the British refused to respect or adapt to. Washington had 2 horses shot out from under him. Bullets tore through his coat. One account claims 4 separate holes. Officers all around him were cut down within minutes. Braddock himself was mortally wounded and died days later. Washington, only 23 years old, survived by what seemed like pure chance and helped organize the desperate retreat of what remained of the shattered column, riding for hours despite his own severe illness at the time. That day never left him, and he referenced it for the rest of his life as one of the defining experiences of his early career. He had watched overconfidence and rigid conventional tactics get good men killed in minutes, watched a professional European army completely unravel the moment it faced an enemy that refused to fight by familiar rules. He learned, permanently and painfully, that raw courage without patience is not strategy. It's just a faster way to lose everything. By 1776, That lesson had become the foundation of everything Washington did as a commander. He wasn't the most brilliant battlefield tactician of his generation, and by most accounts, he knew it better than anyone. What he had instead was something far rarer among ambitious military men: the discipline to accept humiliation, retreat, and harsh public criticism without ever losing sight of the one thing that actually mattered: keeping an army, and with it the entire cause of independence, alive long enough to outlast an empire that had planned for a short, decisive war and gotten nothing of the kind. Historians would later attach a name to what Washington was building: the Fabian Strategy, borrowed from the Roman general Quintus Fabius Maximus, who centuries earlier had refused to meet Hannibal's superior army in open battle, instead wearing him down through delay, harassment, and patience until Rome could fight on its own terms. Washington's version worked on the same core principle. The Continental Army wasn't just a military force. It was the physical embodiment of the entire rebellion. If it were destroyed in one catastrophic battle, the war would likely end immediately, regardless of how the political situation looked on paper. So the single most important objective wasn't winning battles. It was simply making sure that army survived to fight another day, and another, for as long as it took. That meant avoiding large, decisive confrontations with the main British force whenever possible. It meant trading territory for time, retreating when retreat was the smarter option, even if it looked like weakness to Congress, to the public, even to his own officers. But it didn't mean total passivity. When a genuine opportunity appeared, an isolated garrison, an overextended detachment, a moment of British overconfidence, Washington was willing to strike hard and fast, then disappear again before the main British army could respond. Think of it like a lighter boxer facing a much heavier opponent. He can't win by trading punches head-on. He'll get knocked out in the first exchange. So instead, he circles, absorbs what he has to, conserves his energy, and picks his exact moments to land quick, precise strikes, never staying in range long enough for the bigger fighter to land the one punch that ends everything. Washington communicated this shift carefully to his officers and to Congress, framing it not as retreat for its own sake, but as patience with purpose, a deliberate strategy rather than a lack of will to fight. It was a difficult argument to make to a Congress under constant political pressure to show dramatic results, and to a public that wanted decisive victories, not months of careful manoeuvring and quiet withdrawal. But Washington understood something the British command consistently underestimated, right up until it cost them the entire war. Britain wasn't just fighting an army an ocean away. It was fighting the enormous mounting cost in money, manpower, and political will of an endless war fought on unfamiliar ground, thousands of miles from home, against an enemy that refused to simply stand still and lose. Every month the war dragged on without a decisive British victory was, in a very real sense, an American victory in itself, chipping away at Parliament's patience and Britain's willingness to keep funding an increasingly expensive, inconclusive conflict. Christmas night, 1776. Washington's army, reduced and desperate, faced a hard deadline. Most enlistments expired at the end of the year, and without them, there might simply be no army left to command at all come January. Without a victory, and soon, the Continental Army might cease to exist through pure attrition, no battle even required to finish it off. So Washington broke his own pattern, just once, at exactly the right moment, betting everything on a single, narrow window of opportunity. Under cover of darkness and a brutal winter storm, roughly 2,400 men crossed the ice-choked Delaware River in small boats, fighting through freezing wind and floating ice that nearly capsized several crossings before the operation even began. On the far side waited a garrison of Hessian soldiers at Trenton, comfortable, unsuspecting, still recovering from Christmas celebrations the night before, with sentries who never expected an attack in such miserable weather. The attack came at dawn, fast, overwhelming. Nearly 900 Hessian soldiers were captured in a battle that lasted under an hour, with minimal American casualties, a lopsided result that stunned both sides. It wasn't a war-ending victory. It didn't need to be. It was proof to Congress, to the wavering public, and to his own exhausted soldiers who had just watched their army nearly collapse, that this force could still win, decisively, when the moment was chosen with care. Days later, Washington struck again. At Princeton on January 3rd, 1777, he outmaneuvered a British relief column sent by Lord Cornwallis himself, slipping his army around the British flank overnight along back roads in the freezing dark, and hitting them from a direction nobody expected the following morning. Another sharp, decisive win. Another blow to British confidence that the rebellion was one battle away from total collapse. Then Washington did what almost no commander in his position would choose to do after 2 consecutive victories. He went quiet again. No dramatic follow-up battle, no attempt to press the advantage into a broader offensive campaign that risked everything he'd just won. The army withdrew into winter quarters, patient once more, exactly as the strategy demanded, even with momentum fully on his side. That patience was tested at its absolute limit the following winter at Valley Forge. No battle was fought there at all, and that was precisely the point. Roughly 12,000 soldiers endured brutal cold, disease, and severe shortages of food and clothing. Nearly 2,000 men died, not from enemy action, but from the sheer hardship of simply surviving the season. And yet the army held together. Under the training of Baron von Steuben, it emerged in the spring reorganized, better drilled, and more disciplined than it had ever been. Survival itself had become the victory. For years afterward, Washington largely continued the same pattern against the main British army in the north, refusing repeated opportunities for a grand, decisive clash that might have ended everything in an afternoon, win or lose. Even at Monmouth in 1778, one of the few large pitched battles he did fight, the outcome was less about a knockout blow and more about proving the newly trained Continental Army could now stand toe-to-toe with British regulars and hold its ground. Then, in 1781, the war's entire calculus shifted, almost overnight. A French fleet under Admiral de Grasse arrived off the Virginia coast, cutting off any British naval escape route by sea. French land forces under the Comte de Rochambeau joined Washington's army in the field, adding thousands of well-equipped, experienced troops to a cause that had spent years scraping by on scarcity. For the first time in the entire war, the balance of force, position, and timing all favored the Americans decisively, all at once, in the same place, at the same moment. Washington made his move. He marched south with startling speed and secrecy, deceiving British commanders in New York into believing he intended to attack the city itself, while in reality combining forces with the French to trap Cornwallis's army against the coastline at a place called Yorktown, with no way out by land and, thanks to de Grasse's fleet, no way out by sea either. The Fabian general, who had spent 5 long years refusing to gamble everything on a single decisive battle, finally had the exact conditions he'd been waiting for to risk exactly that. Because, for the first time since the war began, the odds had genuinely, unmistakably, turned in his favour. The siege of Yorktown lasted less than 3 weeks. Surrounded, cut off from resupply, and battered relentlessly by combined American and French artillery, closing in day by day, Cornwallis's position became hopeless, with no realistic path to relief. On October 19, 1781, he surrendered his entire army. Nearly 8,000 British and Hessian soldiers, along with their weapons, cannons, and remaining supplies, marched out under the terms of surrender, while, according to popular accounts, a British military band played a tune fittingly titled "The World Turned Upside Down." It was the largest single British surrender of the entire war. When news reached London, Prime Minister Lord North reportedly reacted as though he'd been shot, pacing and repeating the words, "Oh God, it's all over," over and over. Yorktown didn't formally end the war. That took nearly 2 more years of negotiation before the Treaty of Paris in 1783 secured American independence outright. But politically, Yorktown broke Britain's will to continue fighting. Parliament, exhausted by years of expensive, inconclusive warfare thousands of miles from home, voted to end offensive operations in America almost immediately. The deeper lesson of Washington's strategy reached far beyond this one war. He proved that a materially weaker force, facing a vastly superior conventional army, could win not by matching strength for strength, but by preserving its own existence long enough to outlast its opponent's patience, resources, and political will. This wasn't cowardice dressed up as strategy. It was one of the most disciplined displays of strategic patience in military history, executed by a commander willing to accept public criticism, humiliation, and years of frustrating retreat in exchange for eventual victory. That same core idea, avoid decisive engagement, preserve your force, wear down a stronger enemy's will and resources over time, would go on to influence revolutionary and guerrilla movements for the next 2 centuries, studied by military strategists from Vietnam to countless other asymmetric conflicts, all built on the same fundamental insight Washington proved on the frozen roads of New Jersey, that in a long enough war, simple survival can be the deadliest weapon of all. Washington never won the war by being the better fighter. He won it by refusing to lose everything in a single afternoon, over and over again, for 5 straight years. If you were in his position, under enormous pressure to prove yourself with one dramatic victory, could you have held that same patience? Let me know in the comments. And if this story changed how you think about winning a war, hit like and subscribe for more strategies that shouldn't have worked, but did.